as we begin. Why don't you join me in prayer? Father, we just welcome you here, welcome you, Holy Spirit. Thank you that you're already here. Thank you that you love to dwell and show up where your people meet. And I just pray, in particular, you'd meet us exactly where we are today, whatever we're facing, joys and triumphs or difficulties and struggles. Holy Spirit, I pray, minister to us through this book that we're about to delve into, this series that we're about to look into. Thank you that you always meet our needs and you never fail to do that. Amen. 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 So for this upcoming sermon series, we're going to be looking at the second part of the book of Exodus. In the first half of Exodus that we looked at before Christmas, we saw God's people in cruel bondage and despair. If you remember, they were enslaved to the Egyptians. God raised up Moses, and with him Aaron, who dramatically led the sons of Israel to freedom. Do you remember that? Despite the stubborn, hard heart of Pharaoh. Through many signs and wonders, Yahweh showed all Egypt and Israel that he was the true and the living God, in contrast to all the false idols of Egypt. Through plagues on the land, Yahweh put those false gods to shame. He outperformed them in every single way. The plagues intensified as Pharaoh's stubborn heart was unyielding, until God had to get drastic, didn't he? And an angel of death swept through the whole land. It left somebody dead in every single Egyptian home, and weeping could be heard throughout the land. Israel finally were running free, having plundered the Egyptians of their wealth. And so they set out to journey towards the land that God had clearly promised them. So out they went, out they go into the wilderness. The wilderness then is the setting for the whole second part of the book of Exodus, the bit we're going to be looking at in this series. Chapters 13 through 40 of Exodus tell of wanderings and searchings in a dry and barren land. The wilderness then isn't an easy place to be. It's an extremely difficult land to travel through, let alone live for 40 whole long years. An entire generation passed away in the wilderness. In the wilderness, there is no water. In the wilderness, there's no food. There's very little shade from the burning sun. It's a time of trial. It's a time of testing where hardships push you to your absolute limit. And you have the option either to grumble, blame, and deny God, or trust him, thank him, and worship him. The Israelites, as we're going to see, do both. But what I'd love us to see tonight and through this series is that there are plenty, and I mean plenty, of reasons to worship God in the wilderness. We are called then to build altars in the wilderness. We often see Moses and his predecessors building altars to God in the middle of nowhere. They give thanks to God and they worship him exactly where they are. We're going to see that again and again throughout this series, that in the toughest times in life, God shows up, and that there are reasons to worship him in the wilderness. There's plenty to thank him for, even in our driest seasons. So tonight, I'd love it if we can take a whistle-stop tour through the chapters that are going to be the subject for this series. Chapters 13 through 40 of Exodus, the book of Exodus. This is going to be important because there's not going to be time on Sundays to cover every single chapter. So I hope that tonight can set some important context and background for what I believe God desires to teach us as a people. So if you have a Bible with you, it'd be great if you could flip that open and just follow along. We're just going to be skipping through chapters at a time, starting from Exodus chapter 13. Exodus chapter 13, that is the second book in the Bible if you want to follow along with me. So in chapter 13, God reminds the people how far he has brought them. He has redeemed them from the house of slavery, that is, from Egypt itself. That is a huge reason to give thanks in the wilderness. God never wants them to forget the price that was paid for them. So he asked them to sacrifice their firstborn animal and to dedicate their firstborn son. He wants them to remember their deliverance, which is going to be really important when they encounter their next trials, and there's going to be lots of them. God leads them through the wilderness with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. He is faithful to guide them. He specifically leads them into the wilderness because he knows that if they go through Philistine country to get to the promised land, which, by the way, would be way, way quicker, they would not be ready for the war that they would encounter on the way. God then knows what he's doing. God knows what he's doing even in the wilderness. God is worthy of praise in the wilderness. Chapter 14 then sees Israel face an impenetrable barrier. We're going to see more about this very coming Sunday. There's a solid mass of water ahead. There's a raging army behind the people of Israel. Pharaoh and his chariots are racing towards them, and the Red Sea ahead is absolutely blocking their escape. God intentionally puts them in a tight spot so that his power would be made known. God makes the odds ridiculous. The full gathered might of Egypt against a puny fleeing Israel, who were a slave people who are completely untrained in war, and they're running for their lives. How does Israel respond to this? Well, how do you respond in a tight spot? How do I respond in a tight spot? Often panic, fear, fight, maybe flight. Here's God's challenge to the people of Israel and God's challenge to us today. With an army behind them and a sea ahead of them, Moses reminds them, the Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. What a challenge. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. Well, the Israelites quite epically fail in that. They doubt God and they attack Moses. But what does God do? God parts the Red Sea. They walk through as if they're walking on dry land. This is an overwhelming victory. If that isn't an altar in the wilderness, I don't know what is. This leads straight to chapter 15, which is a song of praise. They worship the God who brought them through the Red Sea, who hurled the horse and its rider to the bottom of the ocean. They build an altar of praise, and they've only just stepped foot in the wilderness. This is day one, if you like. It's right then for us to properly rejoice and give thanks when the Lord fights for us. It's right to celebrate his victories, to say, look what he did when we experience deliverance, just like the Israelites did in this moment. Full and entire joy is the package deal. Immediately after this, they're found to be without water. And the only water they can find is bitter and undrinkable. But the Lord makes a way that those waters become sweet and life-giving. That's an altar in the wilderness. Moving on to chapter 16. In a land where there was nothing to eat, the sons of Israel were tempted to grumble, and they did grumble. They asked Moses, Have you brought us here? Have you brought us here into this wilderness to die? They complain not just against Moses, but against God himself. God's response is to miraculously provide food for them from nowhere, out of nothing. Here then is the grace of God. People complain about food, and he gives them free meat and bread. This manna that's provided for them is provided for them for 40 long years in the wilderness. That is an altar in the wilderness. I'd like to suggest, if you are in the wilderness in any way, maybe financially, maybe spiritually, maybe emotionally or mentally or relationally, do not think for a minute that you are uncared for. The Lord knows you. The Lord sees you. The Lord cares about your needs. Hear about Yahweh's care for his people. This is how it's summarized later by Moses. He summarizes it later in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 7. He says, "The Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hands. He's watched over your journey through this vast wilderness. He's watched over your journey through this vast wilderness. These 40 years, the Lord your God has been with you, and you have not lacked anything." What a statement over a desert season. The grumbling, though, continues in chapter 17. Without water to drink, the people complain, and they test Yahweh. They're fickle, they're quick to doubt, they're quick to anger, they're quick to blame. It sounds like me. They're entitled and demanding, they're consumeristic in their demands. Is God with us? So what's God's response? Yahweh splits a rock in the desert and water gushes out. That's an altar in the wilderness. Next, the people war against Amalek. And whenever Moses' hands are raised in battle, supported by Aaron and Hur, the Israelites prevail in battle. That's an altar. And Moses actually builds an altar and he names it, "Yahweh is my banner." In chapter 18, Moses tells his father-in-law, Jethro, of all that God has done to deliver his people. Jethro, who himself is not part of the people of God, rejoices and gives thanks to the true and living God. He offers sacrifice and praise to Yahweh, and he eats with God's people in God's presence. That's an altar in the wilderness. He gives Moses wisdom about how to organize and how to delegate justice. And this advice informs really much needed structure for this budding nation of Israel. This is a pearl of wisdom to give thanks for in the middle of nowhere. This is an altar in the wilderness. In chapter 19, it's time to meet your maker. Sorry about that. With Moses as a mediator, Yahweh meets his people on Mount Sinai. With darkness and fire on the mountain, cloud and great trembling, here is what God says. He says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings, and I brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." What mercy for a people who are so often falling short, complaining and grumbling and disobeying. What reason to give thanks for in the middle of the wilderness? We feel the tension build throughout this chapter, and we sense that something big is coming. And here it is in chapter 20. Chapter 20 contains the 10 great commandments. God in mercy instructs his people on how to live. What great reason to give thanks. What an altar in the wilderness. I don't know about you, but we can often get bogged down with all the shall nots. You shall not do this. You shall not do this. But I'd like to propose a slightly different way of looking at it. Having freed the people from slavery in Egypt, God gives them a new way to live. God gives them a new rule of life, a new standard to live by. God actually creates a new culture, one that's designed to honor him rather than fleeing to other idols, which inevitably leads to corruption of every single kind. Having experienced genuine freedom, the commandments summarize a law that answers the question, now what? Now we are free, how then should we live? You see, Exodus is about freedom from oppression. It's about freedom from cruelty and tyranny. It's about freedom from oppressive slavery. Yet, interestingly, it's not saying that all servitude is bad. God frees the Israelites that they might serve and worship him instead. I think that's really, really important. God doesn't just free his people from human enslavement so that they can go and do whatever they want, so that they can go and be their own masters and serve themselves. No, he saves them and frees them from oppressive enslavement to humans, to sin, and to idolatry, that they might serve and worship him instead. It's not a freedom that is without rules. It's not anarchy. It's freedom under new rules that are designed for our ordered and happy lives, not in serving ourselves, but in serving him. All the commands then of chapter 20 and onwards are to be seen in this context. Remember who you are and remember what I brought you from. Remember how I rescued you. I rescued you from the house of slavery, God says, from a nation of idols, from a nation of idolatry. Do not be like them. Remember that you are different. Remember that you are called to more. Remember that you are called out of that. All of the shall nots are to be understood in this sense of a gracious God longing that he might have a people who praise him, who honor him, who live like him, and reflect him authentically in a very broken world. These commands are the bedrock of any stable society. And many of our laws, in fact, many of the laws of the nations all around the world are still based on these laws. Theft and murder and libel, which is false witness about your neighbor. It could, in fact, be argued that the commands of the 10 commandments, the ones our culture now today doesn't take seriously, the ones that are no longer any part of our legal system, they perhaps are the greatest flaws of this country, perhaps the greatest flaws of this culture. For example, if I might pick a few that I don't think we take seriously anymore, maybe the sanctity of marriage, maybe the stability of the family unit, maybe coveting and the drive of consumerism, maybe honor of parents and elders, maybe a holy respect for rest as understood by the Sabbath. Chapters 21 to 23 unpack these new laws for a new land. They explain the 10 commandments and flesh them out for the Israelite culture and context. Some of the rules sound really foreign to us. They're about oxen and donkeys and goats and boiling a goat in its mother's milk. They seem totally strange for us. Obviously, they're really normal for Bob, but for us, they're just so foreign. But that's because it was an agricultural society. It's known as an agrarian society. These were practical commands for daily life because everyone had oxen and donkeys and goats. If these commands were rewritten for today, they'd probably concern about, how to be nice when you write an email. some of the rules are really, really intense, but they need to be laid down because life is given an extremely high value by God. The laws concern rights and proper treatment of others, including women, slaves, and even animals. There are severe penalties for intentionally hurting someone else. The message is, don't mess around with the way you treat other people, especially those more vulnerable than yourself or those that you have authority over. What a huge challenge. I find that a huge challenge. There will be serious consequences if you do. Watch carefully how you treat the marginalized and the easily downtrodden, the foreigners, the widows, the orphans, the poor. This is how it's put in chapter 23, verse 9. You shall not oppress a stranger, since you yourselves know the feelings of a stranger, for you also were strangers in the land of Egypt. And here's a summary of some of the laws that you could tattoo on your arm. You shall not follow the masses in doing evil. You shall not follow the masses in doing evil. Chapter 23 ends with Yahweh promising the people that he will go before them and lead them into the promised land. It's a land full of strong and fierce people with battles ahead that are way too difficult for them. But he, Yahweh, will fight their battles. He will send his angel ahead of them the whole way. He will drive out those other nations bit by bit. He will be an enemy to their enemies. What an altar in the wilderness. In chapter 24, the sons of Israel affirm their covenant with God. They seal the deal. Essentially, they do the modern equivalent of shaking hands, and both parties swear an absolute yes to this deal. The people promise complete obedience to Yahweh. I don't know about you, but it sounds all a bit too good to be true. Moses builds an altar at the foot of the mountain. And see, this is an incredible passage. See what happens when he takes some of their elders up the mountain with him. 24 verse 9. Then Moses went up with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu. Those are two of Aaron's eldest sons. And 70 of the elders of Israel. And they saw the God of Israel. They saw the God of Israel, and under his feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the sky itself. Yet God did not stretch his hand out against the nobles of the sons of Israel. And they saw God, and they ate and drank. To have a meal with someone in this cultural context is the essence of friendship and fellowship. It's the essence of acceptance. The people of Israel, the nobles of the sons of Israel, ate and drank with God. This is all part of sealing the deal. Moses goes up the mountain again, and the glory of the Lord up there was like a consuming fire on the mountaintop, because God glories in the wilderness. Moses is up there 40 days and nights, and he receives a pretty important download while he's up there. Chapters 25 to 31 then, up on that mountain, God gives Moses very specific and detailed instructions for a tabernacle, a tent dwelling among their camp that's going to host the presence of the living God. There is loads of detail given on this. And I don't know about you, but I find it can often be very confusing, very overwhelming. But I think it's really, really important, really important. And so I'd love us just to look at a few of the details of the tabernacle, a few of the themes that it brings out that I think are really important for us. Firstly, redemption. Chapter 25 makes it really clear that all the raw materials used for building the tabernacle are donated. In a sense, they are second-hand items. They're repurposed. A lot of it was plundered from the Egyptians. The precious jewelry that they stole from the Egyptians was melted down, silver and gold, and reused. So this isn't just vintage or eco-friendly or earth-friendly. No, this is redemption. This is using the raw materials that God put there in the earth and redeeming those items that possibly and were being used for idol worship and often just selfish and personal use, and using those raw materials for the glory of God, which is what God put those elements in the earth for. God is building a temple, a tabernacle, a place of worship for himself. And it's going to take personal sacrifice. It's going to take the free willing giving up of the whole community's resources. Secondly, craftsmanship. It's worth spending some time considering the construction of the tabernacle and the people who made it, because whole detailed chapters of Exodus are devoted to this subject. The contents and the frame of the tabernacle is laid out extremely specifically by God. God is so specific on every single detail. Everything is to be really well made, well crafted, luxury in quality. Everything, and I mean everything, is coated in gold. The table, the lamp, the ark, with cherubim facing the mercy seat on top, their wings spread high. The boards, all the wooden boards used for the construction, are coated in gold. The curtains are beautiful, they're ornate, the work of weavers, with the Holy of Holies in the midst of the holy place. A court is to be constructed all around the tabernacle, a fence of curtains with a light continually burning in the holy place. Remember that these people, as a people, they were already tent makers. They were tent makers. They knew this construction. It wasn't like us, struggling around with a one-man pop-up tent. They knew how to make tents. This tabernacle work employed highly skilled craftsmen, carpenters and weavers, metal workers, jewelers, tent makers. See how God speaks about these manual laborers in chapter 31. Chapter 31 from verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom, in understanding, in knowledge, in all kinds of craftsmanship, to make artistic designs for work in gold, in silver, and in bronze, and in cutting of stones for settings, and in the carving of wood, that he may work in all kinds of craftsmanship. And behold, I myself have appointed with him Oliab, the son of Asimach, of the tribe of Dan, and in the hearts of all who are skillful, I have put skill, that they may make all that I've commanded you. All of this massively uplifts and honors the work of craftsmen, builders, manual laborers, construction workers, actually anyone who works with their hands. They are not laborers that we can treat like trash. If I can speak just from a little personal experience, they are not second-rate citizens that we employ to do our dirty work. They are men and women made in the image of God, equal in value to each one of us. They are making things for glory and for beauty in the best possible sense, using their God-given gifts to bring God glory. See that in how God speaks about those who make the priestly garments. See that in chapter 28. From verse 2, you shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother, for glory and for beauty. You shall speak to all the skillful persons whom I have endowed with the spirit of wisdom, that they may make Aaron's garments to consecrate him, that he may minister as priest to me. Thirdly, the tabernacle reminds us that we are to worship as we go. We're to worship as we go. This tent was a portable place of worship. They were to lug it around and put it up everywhere they went. What a hassle. Massive bits of timber, which are heavy enough, and then they decide to coat them in gold. But it was worth it. It was worth it, because wherever they went, God went with them. It was worth it, because wherever they went, they could worship God when they got there. Can I ask, do you want to go anywhere if God isn't going with you? Do you want to do anything if God isn't saying do it? Really, it could be said that there's no point in going anywhere if you're not going to worship God there. There's no point in doing anything if you're not going to worship God in it. Why? Because worship of God is the point. The going and the doing of things, anything, become avenues and opportunities to worship and trust God. We're called then, just like the Israelites, to build altars in the wilderness. We're called to worship God wherever we go, remembering that God goes with us. We're commissioned to set up stones of remembrance wherever he calls us. Fourthly, and most importantly, consider this. Consider this, the tabernacle on a simple level was just one tent in the middle of loads of other tents. That's all it was. It was basically the same essence as everything else around it. The people dwelled in tents, and God dwelled in a tent. There was Aaron's tent, there was Moses' tent, there was Miriam's tent, there was Bob's tent, he was there too, and there, right next to it, there's God's tent. What does this mean? For the Israelites, it meant that God came and tabernacled among us. He came and he made his home among us. It was a home exactly like one of ours. It was a tent like the ones that we live in. Does that remind you of anything? Jesus came and he tabernacled among us. He took on a frame just like ours. In fact, exactly like ours. Flesh and blood. He came that he would come and show us that he cares, that he would come and show us that he understands, that he would come and show us, most of all, that he is with us. God with us, Emmanuel. That is exactly what it says at the beginning of the book of John, John's Gospel, chapter 1. Let's look at it together. This is verse 14. I've included the Greek because I thought it would be helpful. Kaiologos, and the word, egeneto sarx, became flesh, and eskenosen, and human, and he dwelt among us, and ethelmetha ten doxan orto, we beheld his glory. Okay, what's most important here is this word eskenosen. I wonder if this works. No, the word for he dwelt. The word for dwell there, that he dwelled among us, literally is the word tabernacle. So John uses a word for Jesus dwelling among us that literally is the word to dwell in a tent. The New Testament says that Jesus tabernacled among us. He came and he moved in to a home that's just like ours, a home of flesh and blood. The Message translation hits it right on, I think. It says he moved into the neighborhood, our neighborhood. He took up residence right in the middle of where we already live. John goes on to say at the end of this verse here that we beheld his glory. We saw his glory. which is exactly what happened again and again at the original tabernacle. God showed up and we saw his glory, the temple, the tabernacle filled with God's presence again and again. The first tabernacle with Moses was a precursor to the true tabernacle, Jesus, coming into the world where God would meet with man in the person of Jesus Christ. See, the glory of Sinai, way up on there on that mountain, that was awesome. Those clouds, that darkness, that fire, that was awesome. But God wasn't content to meet with his people sporadically. You know, like that uncle who you love, but you only see him at birthdays and Christmases. You know, no, God wanted to be with his people every single day through the tabernacle, visibly, with a cloud of glory right in their midst. God isn't just for special occasions then. He isn't just for weddings or funerals or national emergencies. He isn't just for earthquakes or fires and floods, although he does certainly turn up. God isn't just even the God of Sundays, the God who turns up and makes us feel special at church events, although he definitely does that. God is the God of every day, the gods of the high and the lows, the God of meetings and school and marriage and family and bosses and employees and 5 p.m. traffic. How do we know that? Because he pitched his tent right next to ours. He desires that his glory would regularly show up. He reminds us that he's always there, right next to us, right here, right now. At this place then, this tabernacle, this physical place, God will meet with his people. He will meet with Moses and tell him everything he needs to know. This is God's mercy. He deeply desires to meet with his people. And it doesn't end there. The tabernacle doesn't just say, I am with you. It also says, I will atone for your sins. That is to say, I will meet your deepest need. I will provide a way for you as sinners to meet with a holy God, to be cleansed through the shedding of blood. This tabernacle then is a meeting place between heaven and earth, where God will meet with his people, hear their cries, intercede for them, and atone for their sins. Because at the heart of the tabernacle is an altar. What this means is that in the wilderness of all places, God's mercy is beautifully on display. In the wilderness, God provides himself. He gives himself to his people, his presence made possible through propitiatory, that is, sacrificial atonement. Here then is how God summarizes the whole point of the Exodus. What was the point of the Exodus? Here's what God says in chapter 29, verse 46. They shall know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt. Why? God, why did you bring them out of the land of Egypt? That I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. In other words, the tabernacle was the point of the Exodus. The tabernacle was the point of the whole Exodus. God brought the Israelites out of Egypt so that he could dwell in them, so that he could be with them in the closest possible sense. He brought them out so that he could have relationship with them, covenant relationship. And the place where he chooses to dwell with them is in the wilderness. Now, there was a lot there, and there's more to come. So now might be a good time if we have a break, maybe grab a tea, grab a coffee, and then we'll come back together again. Let's go.
Things broke down.
All right, so let's make a start, shall we? Great. Well, I hope you've had a chance to be refreshed a little. On then to yeah, give me 2 minutes. We'll jump back into chapter 32. Chapter 32. So after all these heavenly visions then of the tabernacle plans, how do the people respond? What does Moses find when he comes back down the mountain? Well, he finds a tragic scene. The reality on the ground is the worst kind of idolatry and immorality. The people have made their own altar. They've fashioned a golden calf and they're worshipping it. Aaron builds a calf before it. They fall down and they worship the calf that has delivered them from Egypt, or so they say. In reality, they've gone back to their old ways, their old worship in Egypt. The calf was a symbol of fertility and strength in that land. In essence, the Israelites have a worship festival. They're singing and dancing and mayhem, but it's the wrong sort of worship. This is an altar in the wilderness, but it's an entirely wrong kind of altar. The people are so impatient, so ready to forget Moses up the mountain. Who is he? So ready to forget the real God who saved them from Egypt. Aaron leads them, and later he blames them and absolves himself. Moses has to intervene to stop God killing them all, reminding God of his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The text says that the people are out of control. The whole community is participating in sin, encouraged by each other, egging each other on. It's like Maisie Day on steroids. Moses then, you've been there at night, it's awful. Okay, so Moses breaks the tablets of stone that he has brought down, signifying a broken covenant. And this is only 6 weeks after the whole community announced their eternal faithfulness to Yahweh. This must be a warning to us. We must be careful of the altars we build. As we examine our lives, the way we spend our time, our energy, our resources, the things that we build our hopes and dreams and fears upon, what altars are we building? On a brighter note, it's worth noting that this awful scene in chapter 32 interrupts the plans for the tabernacle in 25 to 31 and the making of the tabernacle in 35 to 40. In other words, there's this massive overarching story about the tabernacle, and there's this horrible story about an altar before a golden calf right in the middle. Why? I think the interruption in the tabernacle story is entirely intentional. It says that nothing will stop God's plans to be with his people. Our human rebellion, our wicked, wayward hearts will not disrupt his plans. He is determined not only to be with his people, but also to atone for their sins. In chapter 33, the story continues. God says, "Go on up to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go with you. I will probably kill you if I went with you. Go have all the blessings, but you will not have me." Moses knows that this is not enough. There's no point in going if God doesn't go with them. It's at tough times like this, trying times, that Moses used to go and hide himself in God's presence. He was addicted to God's presence. It was the only place he knew to go for help. And it had a huge effect on the rest of the community. Just look here how one man's genuine worship can affect the whole community. Chapter 33 from verse 7. Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, a good distance from the camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. And it came about, whenever Moses went out to the tent, that all the people would arise and stand, each at the entrance of his tent, and gaze after Moses until he entered the tent. Whenever Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. When all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all of the people would arise and worship, each at the entrance of his tent. Thus the Lord used to speak with Moses face to face, just as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses returned to the camp, his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. So Moses, and consequently the rest of the people, choose to worship God and build an altar in the wilderness. Chapter 34, Moses then goes a step further, and he boldly asks, God, show me your glory. Show me your glory. God, in his mercy and kindness, does exactly that. He hides Moses in a rock. And here is one of the pinnacles of the book in chapter 34, from verse 6. Then the Lord passed by in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and fourth generations. So God renews his covenant with the people. Moses is up on the mountain for another 40 days and nights. He comes down with 2 new tablets and a face that is continually shining bright with the glory of God. Don't let anyone tell you that God doesn't show up in the wilderness. Chapters 35 to 40, these final chapters of the book, tell of the construction of the tabernacle, actually making it happen and paying for it. It is a huge, huge project. Where even to begin? Well, it was God's idea, so God makes it happen through his people, through free will offerings, through incredible artistic and creative gifts that he gives to his people. To do great things for God, everyone must take part. The hearts of the people were moved, it says, and their spirits were stirred to give and to do certain tasks in order for it all to happen. The artistry of the tabernacle is second to none. The cost is astronomical, but God doesn't skimp on the details or the extravagance. This is worship to him. What a reason to give thanks in the wilderness. They ended up with enough donations and plenty to spare. They had to tell people to stop giving. Get this, in building the tabernacle, they used 100 talents of silver. That's 3.34 tons, which in today's money would cost you about 2 million quid. They used 29 talents of gold. That's 986 kilograms, which in today's money would set you back 49 million pounds on a tent. You can sense the growing anticipation and satisfaction as each element of the construction and contents are set in place bit by bit. This has been a truly mammoth task, and you can feel the relief as they finally get done. Grand designs eat your heart out. See the summary in chapter 39, verse 43. And Moses examined all the work, and behold, they had done it. Just as the Lord had commanded, this they had done. So Moses blessed them. At the end of chapter 40, the very last verses of the book, they show us what all this hard work of building the tabernacle has been for. What was it all for? Well, God dwells in the tabernacle. The presence and the glory of Yahweh so filled the tent that Moses couldn't enter it. What a magnificent altar to praise in a barren land. What an altar in the wilderness. Here it is, the very last verses of chapter 40, from verse 34. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the sons of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out until the day it was taken up. For throughout all their journeys, the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and there was fire in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel. God is showing his absolute pleasure with their hard work, with their sacrifice, and their complete obedience. They have done exactly what he asked them to do. This will be the place, this tabernacle will be the place where God meets with his people, where the people meet with God for the next 300 years. What an accomplishment. See that the cloud of glory wasn't just for the moment that it was completed. No, it continually filled it. Cloud by day, fire by night, until it was lifted and the sons of Israel would know that they could set out to their next destination, step by step into the promised land. So finally then for us, can I ask, how do you respond in the wilderness? I know I get angry pretty quick. I get impatient. I try to control my situation so that it doesn't feel so chaotic and confusing. How do you respond, can I suggest, when the cupboard is bare? When filling your car with petrol costs too much? When the heating bill is astronomical and it feels like you'll have nothing left? For the Israelites, desert life was outrageously tough. It was baking hot, there was no water, and there was nothing, and I mean nothing, to eat. The complaints began quickly, really quickly. What might be your wilderness? Might it be relationships or work, self-identity or loss, bereavement, pain, sickness? Friends and family, I think there's a really important message for us here. God triumphs in the wilderness. God glories in the wilderness. God makes himself known in the wilderness. Why? Because in the wilderness, God's people are finally brought to their knees. And Yahweh can finally prove the kind of provider that he is. He provides water from a rock. He rains down manna from heaven for 40 whole years. Year after year after year after year, he provides. Hasn't that been your experience? He parts waters so that his people can walk across on dry land. He is never short on resources. But he teaches his people that they might have daily dependence and daily obedience. Please, friends, do not forget that in the wilderness of all places, God speaks, God instructs, God guides, God protects. In the most barren places, God makes himself known. He reveals himself like never before. He makes a home for himself amongst his people. He has friendship and fellowship with his people. And he makes a way for that relationship by atoning for their sins through sacrificial blood. In the wilderness, God provides opportunities again and again for us to worship and trust him, to set up altars of remembrance to his goodness. The wilderness is a testing place. It will and it does reveal our impatience, our selfishness, our greed, our hearts that are often fickle, which often quickly turn away from all of God's proven goodness. In those moments, we're called to remember and worship the true and living God, even when we don't feel like it. Even when we're tempted to bitterness and grumbling. We're called to reject all false worship in those moments, any temptation to worship anything other than the true God, to put our trust in any other deliverance. We are called then to build altars in the wilderness, to set up stones of remembrance wherever he calls us. We're to say and to remember, this far he has brought us, and without him I would not be here. Without him we would not be here. We're called to worship him in the wilderness, wherever he calls us, to whomever he calls us, to whatever job, whatever village or town, whatever family or people, whatever difficulty or trial or struggle, whatever middle of nowhere place where you don't know where you're going and you don't know what you're doing. We're called to say, God has placed me here. God has a purpose for me here. And we will worship him here, right now, without hesitation, without delay, without doubt or fear. And as we worship him, I think he may well begin to give clarity. He may well give guidance for the next steps as we come to his altar and pour out our praise. He did that for Moses. He did that time and time again. As Moses came into the tent of meeting and the cloud of glory descended, and God showed him what next, despite the fact that he was often surrounded by a nation of grumblers and idolaters. All hell was breaking loose outside, but God's glory and revelation and insight was breaking loose inside. All hell was breaking loose outside, but God's glory and revelation and insight was breaking loose inside. How much truer is that for us? How much more privileged are we than Moses? How much more privileged? Moses got the glory of a cloud descended. Moses got to see the glory of God's back as he passed by, to hear that God was compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. But the Apostle Paul tells us that we have the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. We have the immediate presence of a holy God given to all believers through one Holy Spirit who's been given to all who trust in Jesus, no matter what age or race or gender or station. The glory and the presence of God has been blown wide so that we no longer can only find him in a limited tabernacle in the corner of the Middle East. No, we can access him anywhere, anytime, any situation. It's time to build some altars in the wilderness. It is time for us to build some altars in the wilderness. It's time to declare that God is unarguably and irresistibly good, even on our darkest and driest days, that he's faithful even in trial, that he makes Edens out of wastelands, that he causes his name to be remembered and honoured even in the wilderness, that he makes altars of praise in a barren land. All of this means that we can truly say, as fully as the generation of Moses did, and indeed with far greater confidence in light of the redeeming work of Jesus Christ, hell or high water, I will build an altar. So I love us just to listen again briefly to that song, and let the words minister to you as we close. Thanks so much.